Okay, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. It's my honor to introduce to us our esteemed lecturer today, Brother Nabil Yasien Mohamed. He's currently a lecturer in Islamic Studies in the Department of Religion and Theology at the University of West Cape and a PhD candidate at the University of Cape Town. He's the author of Ghazali's Epistemology, a critical study of doubt and certainty, which was recently published, and that is what he's speaking to today. So we're honored to be able to get that ability to learn directly from the author today. He holds an MA in philosophy from the University of West Cape and an honors degree in Islamic Studies from the Islamic Peace College of South Africa, and a BA degree in politics, philosophy, and economics from the University of South Africa. He also has a BSc honors degree in engineering from the University of Cape Town. Nabil has spent several years in Egypt studying Arabic and traditional Islamic studies. His research interests and publications include Ghazalian studies, classical Islamic philosophy, contemporary Islamic thought, theology, epistemology, and ethics. So, alhamdulillah wa shukr Allah, I will stop sharing here, and Brother Nabil, I will invite you to the stage and to share your slides with us and to get started. So, wabillahi ta'ala tawfiq. You can go ahead.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I greet you all the warmest Islamic greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Firstly, welcome to you all, and thanks to ISIP and all the conveners and Sister Fatima for making today's lecture happen. And a special thanks to Ustad Sayyid Jamaluddin, my dear friend. We say we have Jamaluddin al-Afghani, who is an advocate for pan-Islamism. We've given Jamaluddin a kunya. He's Jamaluddin al-Farsi, who's an advocate of Islamic psychology. And mashallah, himself and ISIP and the team, they are really doing great work in terms of promoting Islamic psychology and furthering the discourse around Islamic psychology. In my time in Egypt, many people spoke of the work of ISIP in a positive light, as well as here in Cape Town, at the very tip of Africa. I've come across many students of Islamic psychology that's following the work of ISIP really closely. So today's lecture is on Al-Ghazali's quest for certainty. It's essentially a book talk on a book that was published in 2023. Just recently, the paperback came out 2 months ago. Ghazali's Epistemology, a critical study of doubt and certainty. I was hoping to do a full treatment of the book, but I think considering the time, I'll just be focusing on 1 or 2 chapters that may be of some relevance for Islamic psychology. Al-Ghazali, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, for many of you, as you all know, I don't think he requires an introduction. He's probably the most influential scholar in Islamic intellectual thought. He is akin to the likes of St. Thomas Aquinas in the Christian tradition, and is really a paradigmatic figure. It's impossible to speak about the Islamic intellectual tradition without some reference to Al-Ghazali. Any scholarship that comes after Al-Ghazali is somewhat of a footnote to Al-Ghazali. And so he influences many disciplines, many sciences, philosophy, theology, fiqh, as well as Islamic psychology, right? Islamic psychology or ilm al-nafs. And he's considered Hujjatul Islam, right? The proof of Islam. And it has been unanimously recognized that Al-Ghazali was the mujaddid of his century. Like our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he said that every century Allah will send a mujaddid to revive his deen. And so Al-Ghazali was considered unanimously to be the reviver of the deen in the 12th or 11th century. And so one thing that really stands out about Al-Ghazali is that he was relentless, right? He had this relentless pursuit of truth, this relentless pursuit of certainty. If I should summarize his life, the essence of his life was about seeking truth. It was about seeking certainty, finding knowledge, finding wisdom. And Al-Ghazali was no dogmatist or religious zealot. And he was someone that was eclectic. You take from various traditions, from various sources, from various disciplines. And that really, Al-Ghazali really embodied the hadith, al-hikmah dalatul mu'min, that knowledge is the lost property of the believer. So wheresoever he finds it, he should take it. Right? So Al-Ghazali, wherever he found knowledge, wherever he found wisdom, he would appropriate it and he would integrate it into the Islamic tradition. So he was a great synthesizer, right? And he really followed Imam Ali's dictate, where he says, do not measure the truth by the man, right? But measure the man by the truth. And so Al-Ghazali took knowledge wherever he could find it from the various disciplines. What I do attempt to do in this book is provide a systematic overview of Al-Ghazali's epistemology, right? It's a systematic treatment of his epistemology with a particular focus on doubt and certainty, with particular focus on shak and yaqeen. A common question many students ask is, what is epistemology? Epistemology is the theory of knowledge. It is the theory of knowledge. How do we know what we know? What are the various sources of knowledge? What is our criterion for truth? What makes certain beliefs justified? Is knowledge possible? And how do we attain certainty? What are the foundations or the first principles of knowledge? These are some of the questions that the subject of epistemology addresses. It's a branch of philosophy in this, alongside metaphysics and ontology and cosmology and ethics and political philosophy. And Al-Ghazali, to define, one of the features of Al-Ghazali's epistemology is its holistic nature, right? There was no tension between reason and revelation, or between mysticism and rationalism, right? It was all in harmony. Al-Ghazali was someone that bridged both the esoteric as well as the exoteric. If I look at the history of Enlightenment philosophy, it's very much a history of the tension between rationalism and empiricism. In the case of Al-Ghazali, everything has its right place, right? And they're all complementary to one another, the various sources of knowledge, whether that may be wahi or mukashafa, right? Divine unveiling or mystical cognition. Or empirical knowledge or rational judgments, right? They all complement one another, and they are not in tension with one another. And so Al-Ghazali is without a doubt, there are many misconceptions about Al-Ghazali. There are many myths about Al-Ghazali, by not only Orientalists, but Muslim scholars as well. During his own life, he was misunderstood. Many of his books were burnt. There's the famous Nishapur controversy in 1106, where Al-Ghazali was accused of being a Zoroastrian. He was accused of being a philosopher. He was accused of being of the Ikhwan al-Safa. And subsequently, he wrote many apologetic works because of these misconceptions. And so when studying the path towards certainty, there's a lot of debate, there's a lot of discussion as to whether Al-Ghazali places emphasis on the rational or does he place emphasis on the mystical. Is Al-Ghazali a Sufi or is Al-Ghazali a philosopher? All right, this is one of the big questions, right? Does he emphasize the rational? Does he emphasize the mystical? What is the path towards certainty? What is the path towards truth? What is the path, the best means by which we can come to know the haqaiq al-ashya, or the reality of things? How do we come to gain ma'rifatullah, knowledge of Allah? What is the best path? And so there's a lot of debate around this. If you look at early Orientalism, right, there is this classical view, and this begins with the French Orientalist Ernest Renan, where he's really at the forefront of this construction of this decline thesis that post Al-Ghazali, the Muslim world fell into intellectual decline. And in his book that he writes in 1852, right, on Averroes, he puts Al-Ghazali against Ibn Rushd, right? There are two contending intellectual traditions, and Al-Ghazali, he would be the one that dismantled Muslim Aristotelian philosophy, and Averroes is the one that he was the foremost defender and commentator of Aristotelian philosophy, and everything went into decline post Al-Ghazali. And then a century later, mid-20th century, this classical view continues with Montgomery Watt. Montgomery Watt, he also takes this position, particularly that Al-Ghazali was anti-philosophy, right? He writes the Tahafut al-Falasifa, the incoherence of the philosophers. And he makes the argument that Al-Ghazali was anti-philosophy and he was just this recluse Sufi personality, particularly after his conversion or his so-called spiritual crisis. And he says that Al-Ghazali is the one to be blamed who single-handedly offered the death blow to philosophy, and the Islamic intellectual tradition went into decline after that. And with this comes the assumption that Al-Ghazali was anti-causality. Al-Ghazali was anti-science, right? And we see this in popular discourse as well. There's a popular theoretical physicist, Neil deGrasse Tyson. There's a video that went viral online where he talks about Baghdad, and he says there was this Islamic golden age, right, where Muslims were advancing in science and technology, and then Al-Ghazali comes along, and Al-Ghazali was anti-mathematics, and I quote him here. He says that for Ghazali, mathematics and the manipulation of numbers is the work of the devil. And he says that after that, the entire enterprise collapsed. But if one does just a superficial reading of the Munqidh min al-Dalal, Al-Ghazali's deliverance of error, you wouldn't come to this very uncharitable conclusion. And then on the other hand, right, this is the classical conception of Al-Ghazali. Then we have the other extreme. Towards the end of the 20th century, the pendulum has swung to the polar end, right? It was a necessary connection, a necessary correction, but it swung to the extreme end where there's this view, and this begins with Richard Frank, where he says that Al-Ghazali was actually an Abyssinian philosopher. Al-Ghazali was not an Ash'ari, but he had a higher theology. Binyamin Abrahamov, he says that Al-Ghazali feigns his preference for mystical experience. He feigns it to the awam, to the commoners, but in actual fact, he has an esoteric philosophy. He's a somewhat undercover philosopher. And then there are those, particularly in recent scholarship over the last 2 decades, that argue that Al-Ghazali's tahafut al-falasifa, his incoherence of the philosophers, it is a pseudo-refutation. And in actual fact, he holds to some of those very ideas that he critiques of the philosophers. And so, for instance, he adopts the idea of the denial of the bodily resurrection. So we see some of these ideas coming out from Ghazalian scholarship, and this is not just amongst Orientalist scholars. Hujjatul Shaykhul Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, he says that Al-Ghazali was like a Trojan horse, right? He snuck Greek logic into the Islamic tradition. He made Greek logic more palatable, right? And so Al-Ghazali's, he is an enigma. Ibn Rushd said of Al-Ghazali that Al-Ghazali is a philosopher with the philosophers, a Sufi with the Sufis, and an Ashari with the Asharis, right? And so it remains an enigma. What I try to do in the book is I try to give a balanced perspective that Al-Ghazali is not anti-philosophy, right? He was critical of the philosophers, but not philosophy itself. And at the same time, he did give preference to Sufism or mystical experience. Of course, it is impossible to speak about certainty without speaking about doubt. We cannot speak about yaqeen without speaking about doubt. There are two sides of the same coin. And Al-Ghazali is famous, particularly in Western scholarship, because of the parallels between Al-Ghazali and René Descartes, right? For whoever has read the Munqidh min al-Dalal, his deliverance from error, and you've read the discourse on method of Descartes, you'd be amazed by the parallels between the two scholars. And in the book, I don't give much emphasis to this. I hardly speak about it, maybe 1 or 2 references, but there's been much research done on this, the comparison between the two scholars. One would say that Descartes definitely read Al-Ghazali. There's no evidence for that, but it's very much pointing to the fact that Descartes read Al-Ghazali just by the commonality between the two texts. However, at the same time, I think they are very different, right? I compare Al-Ghazali to the Greek skeptics, Pyrrhonian skepticism, academic skepticism, but they were busy with a similar project. So Descartes, in Descartes' methodological doubt, what he attempts to do is he attempts to throw out everything, sense perception, rational judgment, all of his beliefs, he throws it out to establish his philosophical enterprise on strong foundations. So he establishes the foundations for his intellectual project. And eventually, after dismissing everything and deconstructing his entire epistemic edifice, he comes to the famous conclusion, I think, therefore I am, the cogito, and he establishes his philosophical project on that basis. Al-Ghazali is doing the same as Descartes, or shall I say, Descartes is doing a similar thing to Al-Ghazali, where Al-Ghazali, in his methodological doubt, Al-Ghazali attempts to throw out everything and establish his knowledge on strong foundations. So the first chapter, I'm discussing Al-Ghazali's foundationalism. And just a word on Al-Ghazali's skepticism. Al-Ghazali was not a universal skeptic, right? Like your Greek skeptics. Al-Ghazali felt that knowledge is possible. And his skepticism was a methodological skepticism. It was a skepticism towards attaining certainty. And he would apply a degree of skepticism when it comes to undermining heterodox doctrine. But his methodology of doubt, it's a sort of critical inquiry. And so I look at the nature of of Al-Ghazali's doubt in the first chapter. Some scholars have argued it's a psychological doubt or existential doubt. Others have argued that it is a methodological doubt. So that's something that I also address. But Al-Ghazali, he begins this entire project of questioning his knowledge, questioning the methods of knowing, and it begins with taqleed. Right? Taqleed is uncritical imitation. And Al-Ghazali begins there, and he does a sort of sociological study, or we can say that's taking a chapter out of social psychology, where he's evaluating his environment, right? And he's looking at the people in his environment, and he's saying he's come to realize that Muslims that have parents that are Muslims, they become Muslim. If your parents are Christian, you become Christian. If your parents are Jewish, you become Jewish. And Al-Ghazali says, like many of them, they follow the faith of the tradition of their parents. And it's just this blind conformism. There's this taqleed, this uncritical imitation. And Al-Ghazali says that this goes against the human fitrah, because the human fitrah is this innate disposition to want to know the truth, to come to want to know God. And Al-Ghazali says that he had this endeavor to want to come to know what is the fitrah and to live by the human fitrah. And that would mean that he does not follow taqleed. And he mentions the hadith, kullu mawludin yulad ala al-fitra, that every born child is born in a state of fitra, right? And it's his parents that make him a Magian, a Christian, or a Jew. But the innate disposition, the human fitrah, he says that that blind imitation is against the human fitrah, and the human fitrah equips one with the innate capacity to know and the innate capacity to make rational inferences, right? And he says in the Mizan al-Amal, this is the very end of the Mizan al-Amal, his scale of action, his work on ethical philosophy. He says, if only these words, i.e. the prescription to forgo taqleed and to be independent in thought, will lead you to doubt your inherited beliefs, so that you devote yourself to seeking the truth, that in itself will be beneficial. For doubts lead one to truth. For the one who does not doubt does not look, and one who does not look does not have insight, and one who does not truly have insight remains in blindness and delusion. And so it's important to note here, though, Al-Ghazali is not the complete iconoclast. He's not saying you must dismiss everything. This is in the context of the religion of Islam, and he's saying that one has to be critical. He's talking about one's theological school or one's legal school. One has to adopt a particular school on the basis of critical inquiry, not on the basis of taqleed. You have to investigate and you have to understand. And what's important to note is Al-Ghazali is always considered, he's always seen as this iconoclast, anti-authoritarian figure, right? But Al-Ghazali does recognize authority. Al-Ghazali does recognize hierarchy. There is a hierarchy of knowledge. And so it's important that we make a distinction between a rational taqleed and an irrational taqleed. What I just described prior to this is an irrational taqleed, but the rational taqleed is where you recognize that there's a higher authority, intellectual authority, or you recognize that there's a higher authority in terms of knowledge. And so you come to the rational conclusion that this is wahi, or this is prophecy, or this is a particular religious authority, and you're following that religious authority. And then Al-Ghazali, he says in the Munqidh, he says, once conformism to authority has been abandoned, one cannot return to it. For like glass, once it is shattered, it cannot be pieced together, only melted and reshaped, right? And so Al-Ghazali arrives at this point where he tosses out taqleed. Taqleed has no value in his project, and he undermines conformism or uncritical imitation. And so Al-Ghazali then moves to the next faculty of knowing, the lower faculty of knowing, which is sense perception. It's lower to rational judgment. So he's undermined taqleed, and then he moves to sense perception, and he evaluates sense perception. And he says that when I look at the shadow, I see that the shadow is still. But then when I look again and upon closer inspection, I see that the shadow is actually moving. He says, when I look at a star, the star seems to be the size of a dinar, but using geometrical proofs, I come to realize that the star is bigger than the planet Earth. And so he says that I have my sense perception, and I had confidence in my sense perception, and yeah, I have sense data, but then the rational judge or the reasoned judge undermines my sense data. And he says, in the case of this and of similar instances of sense data, the sense judge makes its judgments, but the reasoned judge refutes it and repeatedly gives it the lie in an incontrovertible fashion. And so Al-Ghazali arrives at this point where he has no confidence in his sense perception, right? He cannot trust his sense perception. He says that the rational judge has undermined my sense data. And then he moves on to rational judgments, which is the highest faculty of knowing, right? And our rational judgments are based off self-evident truths, ilm daruri, or necessary knowledge, and self-evident truths, which was for Al-Ghazali his epistemic criterion for truth or for certainty. He's now questioning self-evident truths. And self-evident truths, for instance, would be that 11 is more than 3, or you cannot affirm something and deny something at the same time. Something cannot be impossible as well as necessary at the same time. An object cannot be in two places at the same time, right? This phone, the cell phone, cannot be in two places at the same time. It can only be in one place. My 1-year-old Ali soon came to realize that this phone cannot be in two places at the same time. He's now 1 year old and he's for some reason just obsessed with technology. And so this becomes part of our a priori, this is part of our a priori knowledge, but now Al-Ghazali begins to undermine the certainty of self-evident truths, right? This is the highest level of a rational certainty. And he says, perhaps there's a higher state. In the same way that there was a higher state than sense perception, perhaps there's a higher state than rational judgment. And he says, perhaps it is like in the case of when you're dreaming. When you're dreaming, you have certain judgments that you make. And then when you wake up, you realize that those judgments were not true. Perhaps maybe there's a state, a higher state that would undermine my rational judgments in the same way. And he says that if you found yourself in such a state, you'd be sure that all your rational beliefs were unsubstantial fancies. And so he says, perhaps it's the state beyond reason that the Sufis speak of, the spiritual state of the Sufis, right? Or the state of death. So there may be a state higher than one's rational state. And then he mentions the hadith, الناس نيام فإذا ماتوا انتبه, that men are asleep, then after they die, they awake. And the Quranic verse, today we have removed your veil and your sight is sharp. And so Al-Ghazali arrives at this point where he has undermined his rational knowledge, right? Or he has undermined self-evident truths. And he arrives at this epistemic impasse, right? He's in this where he cannot affirm anything. He's in an intellectual quandary, like he's undermined reason, and rational judgments. So how do you use reason to get out of this impasse? You cannot use reason because he's undermined reason. And he says for a period of 2 months, he was in this epistemological crisis, right? And he describes this as a mysterious malady, right? It was a symptom of safsata, right? It's a symptom of Greek skepticism, right? So he describes it as a disease of sort, right? And so what Al-Ghazali did was he took things to its logical conclusion. He took his doubt or his methodological doubt to its logical conclusions where he couldn't affirm anything. And now he's at this impasse. And he then eventually finds deliverance. And he says in his Mawqif min al-Dalal that at length God Most High cured me of that sickness. My soul regained its health and equilibrium. And once again, I accepted the self-evident data of reason and relied on them with safety and certainty. But that was not achieved by constructing a proof or putting together an argument. On the contrary, it was the effect of a light which God Most High cast into my breast. And that light is the key to most knowledge. And that light is the key to most knowledge. And so Al-Ghazali, he found deliverance not through reason, right? Al-Ghazali was seeking the unseekable, right? Because the primary truths or first principles or necessary knowledge, that is something that is a priori, it's something that is innate, it's something that you're born with. He's looking for something that is not supposed to be sought out. It's something that's part of your fitrah, and you're born with it. And Al-Ghazali establishes now the intellectual first principles and the foundations of knowledge on the basis of a divine light. And this becomes now the basis for intellectual inquiry. And so it comes from a trans-rational source. It comes from the divine. And so the foundations of intellectual logic requires a logic from on high, and thus it has its certitude, right? With certainty, because it's something that is God-given. It's something that you're born with. It's something that is part of your human fitrah, right? Knowledge of necessary truths you're born with, the capacity for intellection or for abstraction, to make rational deductions. It is something that you're born with. It's something that's part of your fitrah. And so Al-Ghazali argues for this divine light from, it's an experiential phenomenon, but he also makes reference to religious sources, right? Allah says in the Quran, whomsoever God wishes to guide, he expands his breast for submission. And when the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was asked about this, he said that the expansion, it is a light that God, glory be to him, casts into the heart of the believer. In another hadith, it says that God Most High created men in darkness, then sprinkled on them some of his light. So this light is also in the beginning, when you are born, some of this light is sprinkled upon us, and it's part of our human fitrah. And so it is through the human fitrah that one has certainty in axiomatic knowledge, the necessary truths, as well as the acquired knowledge, the deductions that we make off our axiomatic knowledge, but also the innate capacity to know God, right? One intuitively knows God. For Al-Ghazali, he says that we know God through our human fitrah. What's interesting about him, he anticipates Ibn Taymiyyah in the sense that he says that one doesn't require rational proof to know God, that is part of one's human fitrah. Although he's not against a cosmological argument for the existence of God, but Al-Ghazali says that we know this by our human fitrah. And so was this a methodological doubt? Was this a psychological doubt or existential doubt? This was without a doubt. I'd argue that it was both. Predominantly, I would say it was methodological in the sense that doubt is not a default state, right? With the Greek skeptics, the Pyrrhonian and academic skeptics, doubt is the default. For Al-Ghazali, that doubt should eventually reach, you should eventually reach certainty. So it was methodological. It's moving from doubt towards certainty, and you're establishing your entire epistemology on the basis of a certainty. And so it was a methodological doubt, but at the same time, it was psychological in the sense that doubt is a constitutive moment in human consciousness. Al-Ghazali described, I don't know if it's for rhetorical effect, but Al-Ghazali does describe it as a disease. All right, he was experiencing this for a period of 2 months. And also in his maratib of yaqeen, of certainty, it's the movement from shak to dhan, to i'tiqad, to yaqeen, right? So you're moving from doubt towards certainty, but one should never remain in this position of certainty, and you have to move towards yaqeen, even if one has to use demonstrative reason or dialectical theology, kalam, to move from shak towards yaqeen. So it is a constitutive moment. It has a psychological, there's a psychological element to it as well. And so this is famously described as Al-Ghazali's epistemological crisis, right? And of course, people can have physiological challenges, psychological challenges because of something that is epistemic. In the same way, someone can have physiological implications because of one's psychological state, because of loss, because of abuse, because of spiritual reasons as well, because of chemical reasons. This is just an example of an intellectual crisis in the case of Imam al-Ghazali. In the subsequent chapter, in chapter 2 and chapter, I would have loved to do full treatment, but there's not much time. But I'll just summarize the second and the third chapter of the book, where what Al-Ghazali is doing, right? Al-Ghazali was he was engaging quite a bit of polemics himself, and he was straddling two battles. On the one hand, there were the Batiniya. On the other hand, there were the philosophers. But he had an objective in all of this. And with the Batiniya comes from the word batin, which means inward or esoteric. And they were a group of Ismaili Shi'is. And Al-Ghazali in he's written Al-Qistas al-Mustaqim, Fadaih al-Batiniyya wal-Fadail al-Mustadhiriyya, where he deals with the Batiniyya. But in essence, what he's doing, he's arguing for philosophical logic as a means towards certainty. It gives you absolute certainty. And he's challenging the Batiniyya because the Batiniyya that rejected the literal interpretation of revelation of the Quran. And they would say that there's an esoteric meaning behind that text. And as a result of that, they rejected the divine ordinances and the Sharia. And they felt that through the infallible Imam, one can come to know the esoteric meaning behind the text. And they rejected reason as well, because to them, reason is fallible, and one must go to an infallible Imam to understand the symbolic or esoteric meanings behind the text. So Al-Ghazali, he makes an argument for the veracity of philosophical logic, the veracity of reason. He argues from two perspectives. He gives a rational argument for reason, and on the other hand, he shows the presence of various types of syllogisms in the Quran. So there's an explicit as well as implicit endorsement of philosophical logic or syllogistical reasoning in the Quran. But what Al-Ghazali was attempting to do, he was trying to defend revelation and at the same time defend reason and philosophical logic as a means towards objective certainty or acquired knowledge, right? And that was with the Batiniya. On the other hand, Al-Ghazali was dealing with the philosophers, the falasifa. And Al-Ghazali here is defending revelation and he's showing the limitations of reason, that there's a particular ambit, there's a particular domain for reason. Yes, reason can give you absolute certainty within its domain. And so reason has its limitations. And so Al-Ghazali's attempt was to humble the philosophers in his Tahafut al-Falasifa. It was the refutation of the philosophers, but not philosophy. And he was critical of their metaphysics, right, in particular. And in the chapter, I focus particularly on the 17th chapter of Al-Ghazali's Tahafut, where he argues that miracles are possible. The philosophers rejected the literal understanding of miracles. They say, no, miracles are impossible. Al-Ghazali says, he argues rationally that miracles are possible. Why are miracles possible? Because there's no necessary connection between cause and effect. There's no necessary connection between the two, right? There's no necessary connection between eating bread and satiation. There's no necessary connection between fire burning the cotton, right? Al-Ghazali saying that the cause and the effect are created independently from Allah. The cause, the fire doesn't have an innate power, and neither does the cotton to burn, and neither does the cotton have an innate power to be burnt. And this is what we see in the phenomenal world. This is adatullah, the custom of Allah, or sunnatullah. This is the habit of Allah. And because it comes from Allah independently, the cause and the effect, and Allah can break his adah and he can intervene in the course of events, and that is a miracle. And so Al-Ghazali argues that this is rationally possible, and therefore we should interpret those miracles literally, that Nabi Musa alayhi salam turned his staff into a serpent, or Nabi Ibrahim alayhi salam, he was not burnt in the pit of fire. Al-Ghazali says we must interpret this literally. And so what Al-Ghazali, what I mentioned in the third chapter is that Al-Ghazali's Tahafut al-Falasifa is essentially making a room for his Ihya Ulumuddin, because until you respect revelation and recognize the role of revelation, and the revelation gives you access to knowledge that reason does not give you access to, you will not follow revelation and the religious prescriptions within revelation, within the Quran and Sunnah. And so it makes room for the moral life of Islam. And this opens up, and so that was Al-Ghazali's objective, and that's Al-Ghazali's end, was to make room for the Ihya Ulumuddin. And it wasn't just ending with polemics, but it's defending revelation, and is also defending a literal interpretation of miracles and the omnipotence of Allah. And so, yeah, this is the third chapter, skepticism, certainty, and the philosophical tradition. And so in the Munqidh min al-Dalal, Al-Ghazali, he mentions, this now his autobiography, right? And he says that he looked around him and he saw that there are four main groups. And the truth has to be with one of the four groups. Either it is with the philosophers, or with the Batiniya, or with the theologians, or with the Sufis. Because this is his quest, it's the quest for certainty. And he says it has to be with one of these four groups. And he gives a discussion of each one of these groups. He gives his critique of the philosophers. He gives a scathing critique of the Batiniya. And then he moves on and he talks about the theologians. And then finally he talks about the Sufis. And he says that the Sufis have come to realize that they're not people of statements, but they are people of states. They're not people of aqwal, but they are people of ahwal. And he says that, reading and study and writing and discourse and intellectualism came very easily to him. But mujahada, that was challenging, embarking on the path, that is what was challenging for him. And so Al-Ghazali, he says that he had to leave his position. He had to eventually embark on the path. And so he says he endeavored to embark on the path. And he says that in his Muqidh min al-Dalal, he says that he came to realize that whatever he was doing, he was not doing for the sake of Allah. That what he was doing was for his own ego. It was for name, it was for fame. And he was at the time the head of the Nidamiya College. He was, this was a prestigious post, right? This is the equivalent of being director of Harvard, for instance, right? So he was at this, he had this prestigious post. And he was saying that he felt that he was doing this for his own ego. And he says, I became certain that I was on the brink of a crumbling bank and already on the verge of falling into the fire unless I set about mending my ways. And he says that he wanted to leave Baghdad and he wanted to leave his post. And he said he was vacillating between leaving and staying. He was vacillating between being attached to the dunya and moving in the direction of the akhirah. So it was between this world and the next world that he was vacillating. And one evening, you would have this determinism and this resolution to leave, and the next day that determinism will disappear, right? And he says this continued for a period of 6 months, this vacillation of wanting to leave Baghdad. And he says eventually one day, Allah decided for him. And he comes to class and he wanted to teach. He had thousands of students. Many students were coming to him from all around the world. And the students wanted to hear from him. And he suddenly became tongue-tied. He couldn't speak. He said this led to a state of melancholy, right? A deep sadness. So him being tongue-tied and not being able to teach and not being able to satisfy his students, this led to a state of melancholy. This melancholy led to him not being able to eat, not being able to drink. This led to a weakness in his body. And then he eventually goes to a physician, and the physician says that I cannot help you. This is not a physiological issue, but this is a spiritual issue. And this is all in the Muqidh min al-Dalal. And then in the Mizan al-Amal, there's another autobiographical account where he goes to a Sufi sheikh and he says that this is his problem. And the Sufi sheikh says, like, you just increasing your recitation, it's not going to help or anything. He says you have to rectify your heart. You have to do the mujahada. You have to do the tazkiyah. You have to purify your heart, right? And that is what you should do. And so his brother Ahmad al-Ghazali, he approached him on his sickbed. Ahmad al-Ghazali is a famous Sufi. Joseph Lombard, he has a book on Ahmad al-Ghazali. And he says to Imam al-Ghazali, he says, you've bestowed guidance on others, but are not well guided yourself. You've heard the homily, but you haven't heeded it. Oh, whetstone, how long will you sharpen the iron and not cut? And al-Ghazali, he makes provisions for his family. He packs his bags and he leaves Baghdad in 1095. And he goes on the spiritual sojourn for a period of 10, 11 years. He returns to Nishapur in 1106, but he visits Syria. He goes to Damascus. He goes to Hebron. He goes to Baghdad. Sorry, he's leaving Baghdad. He goes to Mecca. He goes to Medina. He goes to Jerusalem. And he spends about 2 years in Damascus. It's an interesting story of how he takes up a job as a janitor in the Umayyad mosque, right? He's seeking anonymity, and he's in the Umayyad mosque, and he's working as a janitor. Nobody knows him. And there's this man comes to the mosque and he approaches a group of scholars. And he has this question, theological question, jurisprudential question, some question he had. And he approaches these scholars with this question, and these scholars could not answer this man. They could not answer this man. And Al-Ghazali, overhearing all of this, he had this deep urge to assist this man and to give him some guidance. And he approaches this man and he says that, I think this is the answer that you're seeking to your question. And the man looks at him and he's almost laughing, like, how is it that you as a janitor can answer this question, but these scholars, they cannot answer this question? And the man goes to these scholars and he narrates this episode. And soon after that, Al-Ghazali left the Umayyad mosque, because I think he blew his cover. But this was Al-Ghazali. He was just working on himself. He was doing mujahada. He was seeking anonymity. He was doing tazkiyah. And in this time, he writes the Ihya Ulumuddin, right? His magnum opus. This is a work of practical philosophy. And in the very beginning of the Ihya Ulumuddin, Al-Ghazali talks about, he says that this book, the objective of this book, he talks about the objectives of the book in the Kitab al-Ilm. He says the objective of this book is, how are we for time? We have 10 minutes left. He says the objective of this book is the science of the path of the hereafter. Ilmu Tariq al-Akhirah, right? That's the focus of this book. It's the knowledge of the path to the hereafter. And he chastises the theologians and the fuqaha. He says that the jurists, they obsess about the minutiae of the law. He says that the theologians, they're obsessed with polemics, right? Theological point scoring. And the grammarians, they concern themselves with fine points in grammar. And he says that because of this, there's been the loss of the science. And he says this is not a new science. He says this is an old science. This is not an innovation. This is an excavation. This is what the Sahaba were concerned with. The Sahaba, they were concerned about their salvation and the Sa'ada in the next world. They couldn't be concerned about petty polemics or the minutiae of the religious law. Of course, Al-Ghazali recognizes the place of these sciences, but this should not be the end, and these sciences should serve the higher science, which is Ilmu Tariq al-Akhirah. And he says that this science comprises of two, Ilmu al-Mu'amala and Ilmu al-Mukashafa, the science of praxis and the science of spiritual unveiling. And he says the focus of this work is the science of praxis. It's not the science of spiritual unveiling, mukashafa. Of course, that is an end. But tasawwuf is not about, and he's very critical of ecstatic utterances, right? He says that this is not tasawwuf, right? The tasawwuf is about that tazkiyah, it's about that mujahada. And people should not confuse the two. And so he defines what is the science of praxis, ilmul mu'amala, which at the foundational level, it is basically Sufi practice, right? It is about the purification of the heart. It is about imbibing the praiseworthy attributes in one's heart. It is about removing the blameworthy qualities. It is about zuhd, right? Islamic asceticism. It is about making dhikrullah and gaining closeness to the Creator. This is what ilmul mu'amala is all about. And of course, because this includes the Sharia, right? The tasawwuf is on the basis of the Sharia. And in addition to all of this, Al-Ghazali, what's interesting about him is he integrates virtue ethics, right? This is used as a sort of theoretical scaffolding. Greek, he draws on Plato and Aristotle and the Greek virtue ethics, right? Al-Ghazali was critical of Greek metaphysics, but when knowledge is universal and knowledge can be appropriated and Islamized, he had no concern with that. So, for instance, the tripartite division of the soul, which is a Greek theoretical construct, he includes this in the Ihya Ulumuddin. So, the Nafsul Natiqa and the Nafsul Shahwaniya and the Nafsul Ghadabiyya, this tripartite division, we see that in Al-Ghazali's work, and he Islamizes that. We also see the four cardinal virtues of the soul, right? Courage, temperance, justice, courage, temperance, justice, and what's the fourth one? And wisdom, right? And Al-Ghazali includes this and he Islamizes it, right? And then you also see the idea of habituation, right? Malaka, attaining malaka and finding the mean, right? He draws on on the idea of wasatiyah in the Quran. And so this is universal knowledge, and he integrates this you see this as a theoretical framework. It comes into the Ihya Ulumuddin. And so wherever Al-Ghazali found truth, you would integrate that and you appropriate it and you would Islamize it. All right. Um, and so coming to, this is a lengthy chapter, but just to summarize and just discuss the essence of the chapter, what I discuss is that Al-Ghazali harmonizes the two disciplines, right? Philosophy and Sufism, or the rational sciences and mysticism. He harmonizes the two disciplines, synthesizing the surety of the philosophical path with the greater luminosity, brilliance, and certainty of the mystical path. All right. And so for Al-Ghazali, yes, philosophy or rationalism can give you a certainty, an absolute certainty. But if we look at it qualitatively, it is an objective certainty. All right. It is an objective certainty. It is not a subjective certainty. And so philosophy Sufism, on the other hand, it can attain the same truth, but with greater luminosity and brilliance, right? But at the same time, it has access to knowledge that the intellect does not have access to. And at the same time, it is a superior type of knowledge because it is experiential. It is dhawqan, right? It's dhawqi. It's something that you can taste. And Al-Ghazali uses the example that you may know the features or the qualities of good health, but experiencing good health is something else. You may scientifically understand the qualities and the properties of honey, but tasting honey is something else, right? Tasting honey is something else. So there's an experiential element. And so in that sense, Al-Ghazali is saying that you gain a greater certainty through the path of Sufism. But what's interesting to note, he also harmonizes it or synthesizes it in the sense that Al-Ghazali says that a necessary prerequisite, let me not say necessary prerequisite because there are exceptions to the rule which he discusses, but a prerequisite prior to you embarking on the Sufi path, he says you have to study the rational sciences, all right? He says many Sufis, they would embark on the path for 10, 20, 30 years and they would attain nothing. And he says if they studied the rational sciences first, it would expedite the process. Because many Sufis, they're on the path and they become confused, right? They are khawatir, there are ideas and thoughts, false ideas or whisperings that enter their mind. And if only they studied the rational sciences prior to this, it would dismiss those those shukuk, right? Those doubts or those whisperings or those false imaginings. These are some of the terms that he uses. And so he's saying that it's preferable that someone studies the rational sciences prior to embarking on the Sufi path. And Al-Ghazali does say that he's an exception in this regard. Other scholars differ with him. And this is a really interesting paragraph in The Alchemy of Happiness. He says, he chastises actually those who dismiss other types of knowledge, the rational sciences, for instance, on the basis of hearing such dismissals from the Sufi teachers. He says this is as if a person who was not adept in alchemy were to go about saying alchemy is better than gold and were to refuse gold when it was offered to him. Alchemy is better than gold, but real alchemists are very rare. And so are real Sufis. He who has a mere smattering of Sufism is not superior to a learned man, any more than he who has tried a few experiments in alchemy has grounds for despising a rich man. So this is an interesting paragraph because Al-Ghazali is saying that a real Sufi is rare, right? And he's saying, yes, Sufism is a superior path, but he's saying that it is it is an arduous path. And many people, they never arrive, let alone finding a real Sufi. So he's saying if someone offers you something of the rational sciences, then do take it. It's like saying alchemy is superior, and so therefore I'm dismissing the fact that someone's giving me gold. So he's saying if someone's offering you the rational sciences so that you can come to know the haqa'iq al-ashya, you can come to understand the reality of things, and you can come to know God through the rational sciences, then embrace that. Do not dismiss it because Sufism is superior. And he says most people never arrive there. So he says he regards a learned man to be superior than a mere dilettante of Sufism. And so for Al-Ghazali, both mysticism and rationalism, there's harmony between the two. One has to study the rational sciences prior to studying, to embarking on the path of tasawwuf. And there's no tension between mysticism and rationalism. There's no tension between philosophy and Sufism. But Al-Ghazali seamlessly harmonizes the two disciplines. I think I'll leave it at that. I think we've reached our hour, and inshallah we can take a few questions.
Jazakallah khairan, alhamdulillah wa shukr. Thank you so much, Brother Nabil. Actually, on my summer reading, I had Munqidh al-Dalala to reread, so I feel like you've just expedited that process. Thank you so much. Alhamdulillah wa
Needs
shukr
several
Allah.
readings.
Sorry?
It needs several readings. It's
It
something you can
does. It
appreciate many
does.
times.
Yes. And I really appreciate the way that you were able to, kind of elucidate some of the key points about his ability to rationalize. I think what strikes me when I read the Munqidh was his really dedication. Like it really stood out. Like his dedication to know a science really well before even criticizing it. And I think that's such a beautiful contribution that Imam Ghazali gives to when you were talking about when you move from shak to certainty, but we can't really do that movement unless we really understand well what is being said from the inside of those paradigms. And I think Imam Ghazali, what a gift to this ummah. Thank you so much for this book and for your treatise and going into in depth and offering this in the English language as well. Alhamdulillah. We will be open for questions. So if anybody does have any questions, On behalf of everyone here at ISAP, we thank you so much, Brother Nabil. And we do have time for questions. So if you would like to put a question into the chat, please do so now. Okay, so Sister Masita has asked, the rational sciences versus empirical sciences. Can you make a good distinction between these two examples? Can you make a distinction between these two with some examples? Jazakallah khairan, and thank you, Sister Masita.
Yeah, so the difference between the rational sciences and the empirical sciences.
Yes.
So this is, you'll find this debate, you'll find this a lot in Enlightenment philosophy, this tension between rational sciences and empirical sciences. How does one attain knowledge? Is it through sense perception or is it through reason, right? Rationalization. And you'll find that Immanuel Kant, he attempts to do a synthesis between rationalism and empiricism. In the case of Al-Ghazali, I don't see that tension, but the empirical sciences would be that which we gain from our senses, right? From our sight, from our hearing, from our taste. This is, we receive sense data through through the empirical sciences, right? And that sense data, right? When Al-Ghazali, if we look at his schematic, he mentions that this sense data becomes part of your retentive imagination, and that becomes part of one's heart. And so you receive data via the senses, whereas, and then you can, and then at the same time, you're getting sense data, but also the empirical sciences, it implies it implies experimentation. And so with repetition of something, you come to know a particular reality. So for instance, if you are dropping this mouse, right? If you drop in this many times in different contexts, you come to realize that whenever you drop it, it's always falling at a constant of 9.82. And so you're moving from the particular to the universal, right? And so the empirical method is such that you, through your senses, you're coming to understand the particulars, and then you move into the universal. And so the aggregate of particulars allows you to arrive at a universal judgment. And so thus, for instance, we have, when you eat bread, constantly when you eat in bread, every time you eat bread, you come to realize that you are satiated. And so bread satiates. If you look at cotton and you're burning that cotton, cotton is always burnt by fire, right? And through constant repetition, one comes to realize that a fire burns cotton, right? And so you can make certain judgments on the basis of the phenomenal world. The rational sciences, on the other hand, that involves abstraction, that involves you engaging in reasoning. So you draw on for instance, the universal premises that you establish from empirical judgments, but at the same time, you can draw on necessary truths. So we spoke about and so acquired knowledge can either happen through the mind or it can happen through the senses. That would be the empirical sciences. And the rational sciences, it is where you are engaging in tafakkur and tadabbur. And you would draw on your sense perception, the data that you receive from that. But at the same time, you would draw on axiomatic truths as well. So we spoke about the necessary knowledge, such as 11 is more than 3, or one thing cannot be in two places at the same time. And on the basis of these premises, we deduce certain conclusions. And so this is something that you do internally. The empirical sciences, you are using the instruments of sense perception, and in the rational sciences, you're using your internal instruments. You're using your aql, right? And you can philosophize, you can engage in syllogistic reasoning or abstraction to acquire new knowledge, right? And so that's how I would define the two, the rational sciences and the empirical sciences. But there's no tension or dichotomy between the two with Imam al-Ghazali or in al-Ghazali's epistemology. It's a big question. I think one can do a course on the question alone, but I hope that suffices.
Barakallahu fikum. Thank you so much. Maybe as a follow-up, just as you were speaking, because oftentimes when you're saying the rational and the reasoning, and then like how the Quran is talking about our aql, and oftentimes when we're translating aql or it's intellect or reasoning, but then we are relegating that only to the realm of or maybe you can elucidate more on what Ghazali, how he was describing the aql, because we know that it's a function of the heart. And so maybe if you can just help to elucidate a little bit more about how Imam Ghazali was talking about the rational or the reasoning faculty, and where that, because oftentimes right now, whenever people hear mind, we automatically think brain, and yet we know it's a function of the heart. So I know it's a big question too, but I know Imam Ghazali does speak to that. If you could help to elucidate a little bit more on that.
Yeah, no, this is a big question,
Yeah.
especially within Islamic psychology and cognitive
Yeah.
psychology. And also in the context of AI and transhumanism and our understanding of the intellect. And I really think work needs to be done on the ontology of mind and what we understand by intelligence, and the difference
Yes.
between artificial intelligence and human intelligence. And even if we can attain, I don't think in singularity can be attained, because the human intelligence is very different to artificial intelligence. You cannot replicate it,
Yeah.
right? Because it's not just merely the dimagh, it's not just merely the brain, right? It's not
Right.
just serial processes. And this is where Islamic psychology really comes in. And this is at the root of Islamic psychology, because we are not just a psyche. We're not just the self or the ego. We're not just the psyche. There's more than just the psyche. And so when Al-Ghazali speaks about the aql and the qalb and the nafs and the ruh, he speaks about it. He uses these four terms interchangeably, depending on the context. But there's not just this reductionism to the self or the ego, right? In the material sense, we are not just material. And this is really the foundation before we can even begin to think about therapy, we have to have a understanding of the self. We have to have a sound understanding, ilmun nafs, before we can begin to give therapy. You have to understand the self before you can assist the self, right? And so the ruh, I would translate that as the spirit, that is the life-giving force of the individual, right? So the ruh is the spirit, and that is the life-giving force. And I would translate, and then the aql is a function of the ruh, and that is responsible for intellection and for philosophizing, for rationalization, but that is housed in the qalb, right? And when we think of the aql, we think of that cognition taking place in the heart. And the Quran says, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ أَمْ قُلُوبِهِمْ أَقْفَلُهَا, right? Do they not contemplate or make tadabbur upon the Quran, or are their hearts locked? So the heart, it's a spiritual faculty, right? That it's intellection takes place in the heart, right? Rationalization takes place in the heart. But when we're speaking in the context of the aql, when we speak about rationalization, we're going to use the word aql, right? And then when we're speaking about the qalb, we speaking about it as a spiritual organ, right? And so Al-Ghazali has an amazing metaphor of the heart, and he says that the heart is the spiritual organ, And he uses this metaphor of the mirror, and the heart is a mirror for knowledge, and the heart is the alim, and then you have the ma'aloom, right? And then the alim is the one that receives knowledge. And he says that one can either receive knowledge in the heart, either because of you have your sense perception, right? And then that gets from your sense perception, that gets deposited in your retentive imagination, your khayal, and that gets imprinted upon the heart. And one can also reason upon that. And then you also see, so that's one form of acquired knowledge. On the other hand, the heart, he says as well, that because of disobedience, because of taqaleed, because of sin, the heart can become rusted. So that mirror can become rusted, right? So you have the various diseases of the heart. And so one has to purify the heart. And when one purifies the heart, one can also, so via the senses, you can get indirect knowledge, and via divine unveiling. He says there's a hijab, there's a veil between the Lawh al-Mahfuz and the heart. And when that veil is lifted, then the realities that are on the Lawh al-Mahfuz is gleamed upon the heart, right? But that takes purification of the heart. So this is the seat of knowledge, right? And so these terms are often used interchangeably. And of course, we can never pin it down with absolute certainty. We've theorized how we understand the ruh and the aql and the qalb. And then there's the nafs, right? And the nafs is the self, that is the ego, what we would translate as the psyche. And Al-Ghazali has, of course, the tripartite division of the nafs. Nafsul natiqa, that's the rational self. There's nafsul hayawaniya, that is the irascible self, or the self that inclines towards anger. Your emotions stem from there. And then there's the nafsul hayawaniya, sorry, the nafsul shahwaniya, right? That's your irascible self. And that is where one's desires come from. And the objective is for the nafsul natiqa to dominate over the lower self, the nafsul hayawaniya, which comprises of one's desired self, or the self that inclines, the irascible self, right? And when the aql dominates over the lower self, then one attains equilibrium, right? And that's where one attains itminan, right? One finds tranquility, and then you arrive to a point of nafsul mutama'inna. So you move from the nafsul amara bisu to the nafsul lawama to the nafsul mutama'inna. And so this is Al-Ghazali's schematic, right, of these four terms. And so what's also interesting is when we arrive at mutama'inna, that's the highest level of yaqeen. And what's interesting with the Greek skeptics, they speak about, they didn't believe in knowledge. It's not about attaining certainty. To them, knowledge is not possible. And so they said we must suspend judgment. And upon suspending judgment, we attain ataraxia, which is tranquility. In our understanding is when you attain yaqeen, one develops a tranquil soul. And so that sakina comes from yaqeen. And so to answer a long-winded answer, the aql is used interchangeably in the sense, but depending on the context by which we are speaking, Al-Ghazali often uses these terms interchangeably. So it comes down to the context.
Barakallahu fikum. Do you have time to take another question?
Yes.
Okay.
Bismillah.
So Atufa is asking, is there a possibility of truth being non-centered? As Imam Ghazali mentions, it is to be only really present with Sufis only. Do we have exceptions to this centrality?
What do you mean by, what she mean by centrality? Non-centered?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Atufa, if you want to put something into the chat to clarify that question.
Yeah.
But perhaps it's how Imam Ghazali was saying that the certainty is with the Sufis only, I guess. And so maybe the question is around that. Allahu Alam.
Okay.
We'll see if
So,
Atufa adds anything, but yeah, go ahead.
yeah, you can send something in the meantime, but to make an attempt at it, no, it's not like they have a monopoly on certainty and truth. And Al-Ghazali makes this very clear in both the Ihya Ulumuddin, but he also says that non-centrality being truth, not only being present with the Sufis, is there a possibility of such non-centrality? Okay, I see. So no, it's not only with the Sufis, right? One can find truth with the philosophers, with the theologians. But what Al-Ghazali is saying is that the highest level of certainty and truth will be with the Sufis because it is experiential. It's a subjective type of certainty because it's something that overwhelms the heart. Whereas for the philosophers, that truth will be objective. It's objective knowledge. It's not something that overwhelms the heart. It's something that remains in the aql, right, or the mind, but it's not something that is dhawqi. It's not something that's experiential. But they can attain knowledge of something in the same way scientists can have knowledge of that honey has certain properties. But if you taste that honey, it's an experiential knowledge. But different groups will have different degrees of certainty. And so Al-Ghazali is very critical of the theologians. Why is he critical of the theologians? Al-Ghazali himself is a theologian, right? But he's critical of them because he says, number one, their methodology is it's based on jadal, it's based on dialectical reasoning, right? Dialectical reasoning is where you assume the premises of your interlocutor, right? But it's not on the basis of universal knowledge. So jadal is what we call dialectics, but then Al-Ghazali says that the instruments of rationality has to become burhani. And burhani knowledge is demonstrative proof. That is where you draw on premises that are universal and it's accepted by everybody. Whereas the theologians, they will maybe draw on premises that are accepted amongst themselves, or they'll draw on premises that are accepted with their interlocutor, and they'll argue on that basis. Whereas philosophical reasoning, burhani type of reasoning, draws on universal knowledge. And so Al-Ghazali is saying that there's higher levels of certainty when one engages in Burhan because you come to not just refute the other, but it is an opportunity to come to know the reality of things or the nature of existence rationally. And then the Sufis, that would be a higher level of knowledge, of course, because it is experiential. And so there's the Sufis, there's the philosophers here you'd have the theologians, and there are those that engage in taqleed, right? There's a conformism, and sometimes taqleed is not exactly completely negative, but you may have trust in someone that is an authority, and so you take in your opinion on their authority, but it's not the highest level of certainty. And so one can have degrees of truth amongst these various groups, but to Al-Ghazali, the philosophers and then the Sufis, you'd find the highest level of certainty.
Jazakallah khairan. I guess as I was also just listening to your answer, a little bit of a follow-up. So like the degrees of certainty. But Imam Ghazali, I guess because, there's a responsibility. I'll just kind of I'm kind of saying my question out loud, but so I apologize if it's not coming out right. But there's a certain responsibility that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, asks of any believer to purify their heart, to come to him with a qalbun salim. And
Yes.
so that process of like tazkiyat nafs, can you share Imam Ghazali's opinion on the necessity of really taking on that spiritual journey? Because the way to the tazkiyah is something that we're asked by Allah to purify our hearts.
Yes.
So I guess
So,
yeah.
yeah, so you were saying, sorry?
Yeah, so my question is, like, has Imam Ghazali made clear that the path to purification of the heart is found with, the ilm al-tasawwuf and with the Sufis? And
Yes,
that's,
I think,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I think I think it is clear in Al-Ghazali's work um, that there is this necessity to
yeah,
purify the heart. Like all of his polemic works, I think there is a path, there's a trajectory in Al-Ghazali's works. It's not like he's just engaging in polemics here
yeah,
with Batiniya and the philosophers, but he's vindicating the place of revelation and the Sharia. And the Ihya Ulumuddin now becomes his magnum opus. And this is a work of practical philosophy, of ethical praxis. And in the opening, he's saying that for those, of course, like if all you care about is salvation, then your shahada will suffice,
mm,
right? But the onus is upon you if you want to. And the Sahaba, they were never just satisfied, right? They always question whether they will get salvation. And so Al-Ghazali says, but if you want to get fawz and sa'ada,
yeah,
then one has to do the mujahada, right? And so he's critical of the theologians and the fuqaha because, yes, there are important sciences, but at the end of the day, there is the next life, and you would want to attain sa'ada, which is felicity. And when Aristotle speaks about eudaimonia, right, it's eudaimonia in this world. For Al-Ghazali, when he speaks about eudaimonia or sa'ada, it is felicity in both this world and the next world. And so for those that want to attain the highest levels of yaqeen, those that want to be of the muqarrabun, those that want to attain fawz and sa'ada, ukhrawiya, then one has to purify the heart and embark on the journey. And so
Jazakallah
that,
khair.
yeah. So the ihya is essentially
Yeah,
that manual. Yeah.
alhamdulillah, barakallahu fikum. All right, I think we've gotten most of the questions. I apologize if we have missed anything. Um, there is a question here. It might be another big one, but it says, what is Imam Ghazali's idea or notion of the truth?
His idea of or notion of the truth.
The truth.
Um, so Al-Ghazali, there's different levels of yaqeen,
Mhm.
right? Or of course, the absolute level of truth is the highest reality, which is Allah, right? And Tawheed, that's the absolute truth. You can know the reality of things, but the highest reality is Allah. And there's different grades by which you can know that truth. And he uses a beautiful analogy of the nut. And he says there's four layers to the nut. There is the outer husk, right? This is your shahada, and this is ala lisan, right? So this is the profession of faith. That's the outer husk. And this is there's the inner husk, and that inner husk is the shahada upon your heart, right? And so knowing Tawheed within your heart. So there's the submission or the profession, and then that being embodied in the heart is the second level, right? That is the inner husk. And then there is the nut, which is the center. And he says that level of Tawheed is where you come to recognize that there's no other existent but Allah, right? And this happens through mukashafa, right? So you see that there's this divine unity and everything comes from Allah. Allah is the agent. But you still see, when you look at the phenomenal world, you see multiplicity and you see multiplicity, and you realize that all of that comes from Allah, and this happens through mukashafa, that is a divine unveiling. And so this is a higher level. But then he's saying there's the kernel of the nut, right? There's the oil in the kernel, right? And that is the absolute highest level of Tawheed. And that is where no other existent but God exists. And you see a unity in existence. There's no other existence but God. And this happens through a mushahada, right? That is a spiritual vision. And all other existence are essentially majazi. It's metaphorical existence. There's only one real existence, and that is Allah. All other existence are contingent existence, to use Abyssinian language and Al-Ghazali's wajib al-wujud, right? He is the necessary existent, and this is the highest level of truth. This is the highest level of Tawheed. And with this Tawheed, and this is where he's going, is one develops tawakkul, right? That is absolute reliance on Allah and recognition that everything comes from Allah, right? And so that Allah is perfect in His knowledge, is perfect in His power, in His will, right? And then one attains tranquility. One attains a level of sakina, because you know everything is from Allah. And then there's concomitant states that follow from that, which I discuss in some detail in the book, on the basis of having tawakkul and having trust in Allah. And that is the manifestation of having tawheed, or recognizing that everything comes from Allah and there's no other existent but Allah. And so that is the highest level of truth for Al-Ghazali.
MashaAllah. What a beautiful way to, inshallah, bring this to a conclusion. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us that true yaqeen, that sakina, and that ability to know that everything is from Him and that He always has our best interests at heart. So we pray, mashallah, Brother Nabil, thank you so much for giving of your time and your knowledge and being here with us. We are very appreciative. Thank you on behalf of ISIP, on behalf of all of the brothers and sisters who've helped to put this together. Barakallahu fikum. And thank you to each and every one of the participants for being here, for your questions, and for bringing this majlis of ilm, inshallah. As inshallah, we ask that it be recorded for all of us as something khair and beneficial. And may all the reward, inshallah, go to Brother Nabil and all of his teachers and family. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bring our hearts to this beautiful yaqeen that we strive for. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make this journey in this path one of khair, one of granting of attaining and being blessed with ma'rifah. If any of there's shortcomings, Brother Nabil and any of the participants, I ask for your forgiveness, and any of the khair that we've received, it is all from Allah. Barakallahu fikum. And with that, inshallah, Brother Nabil, if you'd like to close us off with a dua or Surah Al-Asr, we'd be grateful, inshallah.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Wal Asr, innal insana lafi khusr. إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. جزاك الله خير. شكرا كثيرا to everyone and شكرا for receiving me, and it was an absolute pleasure.
الحمد لله وشكر الله. جزاك الله خيرا. Thank you everyone. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
عليكم السلام.